Hey guys, my name's James and welcome back to a series of videos that I'll be uploading to the channel based on magic use. This is a simple look at all the miracles in the game with some strengths and weaknesses, followed by some situations where you might want to use each spell. Hopefully this is helpful. Enjoy the video. Okay, first up we've got heal. Now these come in a few varieties. You've got heal, med heal, great heal excerpt and soothing sunlight for the basic ones, and they just heal an amount of health based on the strength of the spell. Each one, as you go along the tree, costs more faith to use and you get less uses. Now you'll see that it creates a little circle of healing around you. Any friendlies caught in that will also get healed, meaning that it's good for PvE runs because you can heal your friends as well. It's also worth noting that when you get invaded on PvE, your companions and phantoms, their Estus flasks get disabled, so this becomes the only way to heal them, which is always useful. I'd say in PvP that you should be looking towards using Great Heal Excerpt as your spell of choice, because the other spells take longer to cast. This one, whilst it only has one cast for one slot, it might seem not worth it, but it also has the same cast animation as some of the offensive spells, so it doesn't quite leave it so obvious that you're actually casting a heal spell. Moving on to replenish spells. Now you've got replenishment that restores your health. It's a fairly slow regeneration, but it's only one slot and fairly low faith requirement. Then you have resplendent life, which is higher faith but takes an extra slot and restores your health fairly quickly. Then you've got Bountiful Sunlight, which is the area of effect version. Now this one's a fairly hard spell to get, but it is worth it, especially in PvE runs just before a boss. You can cast it on all your friends just before going through the fog, and it will help you out quite a bit. I'd say in PvP, against a high speed duelist, you might not notice the difference too much depending on how fast paced the action is, but it's never a bad thing to have if you do manage to get the cast off. Here we have a spell called Caressing Prayer. Now when you cast this one, it removes all forms of poison or toxic from yourself and any allies nearby. The only advantage for this one, instead of using poison moss, is the fact that it helps allies as well around you, so it's good for PvE runs. But in a duel or PvP against other players, I would always say use poison moss because it's a lot faster than casting this spell. Okay, this next miracle is called Force. Now this emits a small shockwave from the caster at the time, and it pushes everything back. It's got an infinite poise break, so it doesn't matter how much heavy armour someone's wearing, it will push them back, and the same with most PvE enemies. It won't work on bosses or some of the big things like the sentinels, but it is pretty useful. I would say the best time to use this is for a pure caster as a defensive option, to push somebody away who's getting all up in your grill with melee. Now you can actually use this as guard break, as you see here. If someone's being a super turtle and you can't get in for a normal guard break, you can just keep casting Force over and over. It can be used to knock people off ledges as well, but it won't stun lock, so you can't just keep casting it over and over again and expect someone to fall for it. Next up we have Wrath of the Gods, which I would say is definitely a PvP spell because of the limited amount of uses it has. It only has one use per slot at low levels, and this one shoots a shockwave out of the caster's body similar to Force, except this one deals damage, and as you've just seen, it deals damage through walls as well. So you can get pretty creative or sneaky by casting it the other side of a door, as an invader or as a host against somebody else. And I would say the best use for this spell is a defensive one for a pure mage, or actually anyone who can cast it, because it lures people into thinking you're casting a healing spell due to the animation. It can be rolled through for no damage, like you've just seen there, so you do have to watch out for punishes, but for the most part it's a pretty safe spell to cast. Moving on to Emit Force. Now this is a pretty good balanced spell because it shoots a projectile in a straight line that does area damage on the impact. It's got quite a few uses for a low faith requirement, so most builds can use this one. And it's got quite decent damage really for what it does. Probably the best thing about this spell though is even though it doesn't track, it can still hit a moving target with the area damage on the impact, which is really useful, and I'd say in most cases more useful than the other offensive miracle spells because they can easily be sidestepped. Next up we have a spell called Heavenly Thunder. Now this has got quite a low faith requirement, but it doesn't have too many uses, and it shoots some random lightning bolts down from the sky that damage your opponents and mobs around you. Now I don't feel these clips really do the spell justice because obviously you can see that it's got a big chance of just completely missing the target, but anyone who's used this spell in duels or anyone who's come up against it will know that it is pretty useful against another person in PvP. Mostly because when you cast it you're able to move around afterwards, unlike some of the other area of effect spells like Firestorm and Chaostorm. So you can just cast it and then move on to doing something else to keep someone busy. The same sort of principle as Soul Shower, just to focus the attention on something else while you follow it with another attack. So all in all I would say definitely for a PvP duel it is a good spell. The next spell to look at is called Blinding Bolt. Now treat this one much in the same way as the previous spell, Heavenly Thunder, except this one shoots a ball out in front of you that shoots the bolts from the centre. Now this can be pretty good for a duel or for any kind of fight against another player because you can cast it from further away and you start off the area of effect from a different position, which means it's less punishable than Heavenly Thunder before. The end result though is much the same in the way that it's random and it might not hit them at all, and as you've just seen, if you do hit someone direct with the ball it doesn't shoot lightning out, it just does a flat amount of damage and then disappears. Just like Heavenly Thunder, it's got a pretty good cast animation, doesn't leave you too open, casts pretty quickly, and you can move around afterwards. And personally my favourite way to use this one is to cast it and then run and stand under the ball and cast some range magic afterwards, which gives you some protection from them following up with an attack, especially against a melee opponent. I'd say this is more of a PvP spell than anything else, but one thing to bear in mind is that it costs 65 faith to use, which is a fair bit compared to the low requirement of Heavenly Thunder before it. It does only cost one slot though, and you do get some good uses from it. And one last thing to bear in mind with all lightning damage is that it does an area of effect on water, so when it hits the water it does like a splash damage around it, making this spell and the one before it pretty deadly if you cast it in somewhere like the Doors of Pharos where there's water all over the floor. Next up we have some more offensive miracles, and these are Lightning Spear, Great Lightning Spear and Sunlight Spear. Now they're fairly simple spells, just damage in one direction. They've got a fair few uses, making them great for PvE, and lightning damage type is always a good one, especially Sunlight Spear. You can cast that a few times on a boss and you'll definitely make a mark. One thing to bear in mind with these though is they have a very unique cast animation in the way that you hold the spear above your head before throwing it. Now no other spell does this, and this is relevant because when you compare it to something like Soul Spear for sorcery, the cast animation is much the same as other spells, so you can catch people off guard with it. This one does have an area of effect splash damage. As you can see here, I don't actually have to directly hit somebody. If you just hit the floor next to them or a wall next to somebody, it will damage them a slight bit. It's not really enough to make it an area of effect kind of spell, but it is something to bear in mind. Now it does travel in a straight line, it doesn't track at all, so if somebody is dodging and rolling around it generally won't hit them. And when you're facing this online, there is a glitch when somebody's casting it over and over again, where they'll cast it sort of 3 or 4 times and you'll see the normal cast animation, and then probably like the 4th or 5th time you'll see the lightning spear will come out but there'll be no cast animation, or they'll just wave their arm really quickly, and this can actually damage you quite a bit and it can throw you off. I don't know if they'll end up patching this, but it is something to watch out for if somebody's spamming the spell and then suddenly stops for some reason. You might end up taking one of these to the face. Now as you can see here, weirdly enough, while it doesn't track at range, it does track really close up, so if somebody's trying to strafe you, your character does kind of turn around at the last minute and throw it at them. So it's one thing to bear in mind when you're trying to punish somebody using this spell. Moving on, we have a spell called Soul Appease. Now this does an area of effect damage that only affects hollows. It's a really cool spell in my opinion because it's one of the best PvE spells out there, especially for the early areas in the game where there's loads of hollows around. You can just take out a full room with a couple of casts. You can actually use this in PvP as well though, as you can see here. It does damage a hollow host. So if you're invading and you see somebody that's hollow based on their armour, then you can just cast this for some easy damage. With people that are wearing full armour you won't be able to tell if they're hollow or not, so you might need to try this. You can roll through the damage, you can roll through for 0 damage, and if the host does use a human effigy like I've done here, then you won't do any damage to them at all. So it's not bad, it's just an interesting addition in my opinion. Next up we have Magic Barrier, which increases your damage resistance against the 4 magic types, which is Magic, Lightning, Fire and Dark. Now this is great for areas such as Shrine of Amana where there's lots of magic enemies, and bosses like the Dark Lurker who have a lot of magic attacks. It's also great for PvP because a lot of builds have magic in them and it blocks out most of the damage. So it's never really a bad thing, there's never really a downside to this spell if you do manage to get it cast. This next miracle is called Homeward. Now this sends you safely back to a bonfire providing you're able to cast it, which is when you don't have any other players in your world. Now later on in the game this becomes fairly redundant because you do have the Age Feather, which is a reusable homeward bone and doesn't require stats or a slot to use. However, if you're using this at the start of the game before you get the feather, and also if you've run out of homeward bones, this will be quite useful then. Moving on, we have a miracle called Guidance. Now this is a self buff that by description shows up more messages on the ground left by other players for a certain amount of time. Now this will be pretty helpful to new players because they're going to be wanting to look at messages left by other players to help them through the area, such as to find hidden walls or hidden items or a tough enemy. And sometimes other players can be pretty trolly, telling you to jump off ledges or to attack things that shouldn't be attacked and whatnot. But for the most part I'd say it can only be helpful. Now there were some rumours that this spell actually shows up hidden messages left by the game developers and also reveals hidden walls. Personally I've had no experience of this, and it is quite hard to show you this one in action because as you can see from the clip it's not actually showing up any new messages, so it's one just to try out in areas to see how you find it. Next up we have Unveil, which is a pretty useful spell in some situations. It shows you the nearby location of a phantom. Now it doesn't have infinite range, but it will show you the general direction where they are. And if you are in the line of sight, such as here, it will follow them pretty well even if they are in Chameleon, and that's never a bad thing. And it does cost 2 slots though, and it doesn't work on a host if you're invading, so if you're trying to use it as a red or a blue phantom, it won't show you the location of a host. So that's something to bear in mind when using this one. The next one to look at is called Perseverance. This one gives you 150 points of resistance in Bleed, Poison, Petrify and Curse. This is more of a PvE spell I would say, because you've got areas like the Black Gulch where you're constantly getting poisoned, and you've got some enemies that deal Petrify damage and some that do Curse damage, so definitely worth using there. In PvP however, you won't ever get Petrified or Cursed, but you can get Bled. Not many people use that mechanic. The most use you'll find for it is with Poison. As you can see here, it's taken him a few extra poison darts to poison me compared to when I didn't have the spell active. Next up we have the Miracles weapon buff, which is Sunlight Blade. Now this adds a percentage of lightning damage based on the normal AR of that weapon, so obviously the more damage the weapon's got to begin with, the more bonus you'll get. There's not really a downside to using this because lightning damage is good against most types of enemies. The only thing to consider when using any buff though, is that when you swap out your weapon or change it to another one, it does cancel the buff, so you can end up being a little bit more predictable if you do rely on just one weapon in PvP. Finally we come to Sacred Oath. Now this is a fairly simple spell, it just gives you a small bonus to physical attack and defense for both yourself and all nearby allies, much in the same way as the Channeler's Trident buff. Now it only costs 25 faith to use, which is pretty reasonable. The only drawback with this one is that it actually costs 4 slots, which is the most in the game along with the Hex Climax. Now I wouldn't say this is perfect for a pure mage because you won't ever really need these buffs, and 4 slots is just too much in my opinion to use on a pure caster. The way I'd say to use this one is on a pure melee build. If you just use enough attunement to have 1 slot and then use the ring, the Southern Ritual Band +2 to gain an extra 3, you could attune this whilst using some Skeptic Spice to lower the requirement. This will give you a nice edge in melee combat whilst keeping the stats requirement minimal. Alright guys, that's it for Miracles. I hope you found this useful. Again, it's fairly simple stuff, but I hope it's helped at least some of you. Now bear in mind there is a patch coming out fairly soon, I think it's in a few weeks, that will change some of these spells. The basics of each spell will be the same, but there might be some differences in tracking, the amount of uses and slight damage, so do bear that in mind when that one comes out. The next video will be on Pyromancy, so stay tuned for that. After that there'll be one on Hexes, and then after that there'll be one on combos. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.